Auburn, Ole Miss. I've got a few games up. I'm going to be distracted a little bit. We're going to talk through it and have some fun. Let us know if there's any issues in the live stream in the comments. Otherwise, I think we're ready to roll. Josh, should Ohio State be worried? Let's just kind of go ahead with that. Tight game right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's still early-ish in the game, right? Maybe they sort of pick things up, but I would be a little concerned that the same general jitters we saw early in the season have showed up again. And something we talked about a lot, was that Ohio State had played teams that were all really lowly ranked defensively, and they played teams that were all on the bottom of the Big Ten in most defensive statistics. The Indiana game was the aberration, which you noted that Indiana was a great offensive performance against a team that hadn't been very good, but Indiana was also out 2 starting corners in that game. We didn't really know how much that meant. So in terms of overall Big Ten standing, I wouldn't freak out. I still think Ohio State's likely going to win this game. But if you're talking about greater playoff picture where Ohio State stands, I think this re-raises a lot of questions that were there early in the year, right? Is Ohio State that consistent offensively? Are they that explosive? Are they a team that's going to consistently hit enough plays against a good defense that they can score 40 points? And I think that those questions are back on the table. So I don't think you panic, but I do think you're a little less confident that you've got it in the bag than you were maybe this morning.
Yeah, and we've always talked about. We said I re-listened to our live show from last week. Later in the show, we both talked about how we're excited to see what Ohio State did against Indiana because there still are a lot of good things to take away from that game. We were also concerned that, and we said this for a lot of teams, that they look really good in a stretch where they really didn't play a good team at all. Indiana is a better defense than they'll get credit for. We wanted to see how they looked against Penn State. I think you're right that Ohio State's going to win this game. It looks like they're about to score now. My concern is they've now got, one touchdown. We've got about 9 minutes left in the third quarter. One offensive touchdown in this game, in spite of Penn State really being ineffective offensively. That's the bigger concern for me. It's not that it's a back and forth game. It's that, and I'll look at it while you're talking, Ohio State's had a ton of possessions to only have one touchdown on the board. There's a lot of people in the chat that are saying Penn State always comes to play and always gives them a big game. But we have information of 2 good teams they've played so far. The second one is the first real good defense they've played, and they don't look great. So can it be that Penn State does always come to play, but also there's some concerns?
Yeah, I think so. And first, I'll acknowledge Stephen Light. I appreciate the super chat, and you're always sticking around, so I really appreciate you doing that, knowing you're going to be out. That's really generous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty tense game for him right now, right?
Yeah, it is, as a Penn State fan. I think the reality here, you have to admit, is that Penn State is often also by far the best opponent they've played to this point in the year. I mean, their schedule is pretty backloaded with Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State all coming late, right? And Oregon was the other team that theoretically has a pretty good defense that was on their schedule. So, I know the reputation of the Big Ten generally, but I do think Penn State's a very good defense. Don't get me wrong. But the excuse of, or the statement of, well, Penn State comes to play and they're just really motivated, I think is a little bit of a cop-out from reality. I think the truth is Penn State's just a really, really good defense. And when you faced a really, really good defense, you're having a little bit of issues. And that should give you a little bit of concern of how it's going to translate. You can win a lot of games scoring 30 points, but to your point, one of them is a defensive touchdown, and maybe that's a transition into Georgia. Like that's great, but that's not something you can rely on. And if we're talking about like forward predictive, how you're going to win future game stuff, I just care about how good your team is from a quality perspective. I care about how well your offense can move the ball and score touchdowns. You don't get credit for a defensive touchdown in future games. The only thing that's going to win you those games is being able to move the ball offensively and score, unless you can score defensive touchdowns consistently, which almost no one can. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Ole Miss 20, Auburn 28. and I think that Auburn's lining up for a field goal here. This game is interesting because it's kind of going about how we predicted. I think that Ole Miss lost a little bit of momentum early in that game when Corral got hurt, but honestly, this game has felt about like what we felt like. Auburn would have consistently a little bit of an edge, home field, weird plays, Jordan Hare voodoo, whatever you want to call it. We thought that it would be a good game, but Auburn would always just be one kind of step ahead. Is that kind of how you've seen it so far?
Yeah, and I don't remember. I'm sure people are going to remind me if I picked Ole Miss or Auburn.
You picked Ole
I
Miss.
will. I did. I thought I did. Yeah. The thing that flipped this game to a certain extent, you talk about Corral, it was Drummond getting hurt. Because when he went down, you have to realize if you're just have this in the corner of your screen and you're checking scores, Ole Miss does not have any starting receivers on the field anymore. They're out all three starters. They're playing a converted defensive back in Battle and a converted quarterback in John Reese Plumlee at receiver in this game full time now. And his best weapon is his tight end, who's not really that high level of a tight end. So that, I think, to me, that's what stalled them more than anything. And I actually, frankly, will blame Kiffin because he's gone for it on fourth down in easy field goal range twice now. And this game should be like 31-26 if he just takes those field goals. Instead, he went for fourth down with limited personnel and it bit him. So, I'm not saying that's why they won. I'm saying like they were scoring points and or moving the ball really well early. Drummond went out and it's really torpedoed their offense.
In our preview, we talked about what they were already limited with it at both offensive line and wide receiver was really going to impact this game. And it's one of those where people are going to come at us and say they're going to come back on our top 10 because they didn't listen to our preview and say, "Oh, you both had Ole Miss in your top 10 and they looked ugly or lost to Auburn." When in our preview we said a healthy Ole Miss probably beats Auburn by double digits, even on the road. But there's just nothing left there. They're at the end of a brutal stretch. Auburn's coming off pretty clean with Arkansas. And they're coming in just completely banged up, and that totally changes the calculus. And for wide receivers, I don't think people really appreciate, maybe Georgia fans do, that if you've got all of your starting wide receivers out and you're playing a good defense, like that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, when you lose Drummond, who's I don't know, maybe their second best receiver. Mingo and Sanders were really good, and then Drummond was a really reliable guy. The problem is with receivers in particular, you lose whoever your current top guy was, and Drummond was by far their best receiver left. You basically replace him with to start the year, their sixth best receiver is now on the field because Drummond's out. And they don't have a lot. They've got one guy, number 0, that has made some plays for them, and that's how they've gotten down the field in field goal range. But long term, I can't, and I said this when we had them in the top 10, right? And you made the same point. I don't expect them to stay there in our rankings because with this injury situation, it's not tenable. I don't know if it's the Auburn game or a future game. The Auburn game's not out of reach. It's getting hard, but it's not out of reach. But there's just no way that they're going to stay a one-loss team with this level of injury. They just can't do it, I don't think. And Corral, of course, is playing on 2 sprained ankles on top of it.
So we got a super chat. As a Bama fan, the Iron Bowl is looking scarier now, Joseph said. I think any game on the road in that series is pretty scary. But right now, I think that like if I were picking that game right now, I would say there's a lot of things matchup-wise that Alabama is going to really strain Auburn. And if you think about like all of their ability to manufacture points, it's really hard to manufacture 40 points. You might, like, if your defense can show out and you can hold a team to 24, like you can have a crazy game and manufacture points. But I don't see Auburn holding Alabama under 40, and I don't see Auburn, even if they have some things go their way, they're going to have an offensive scheme and strategy working like they did in 2019 where they could run it and keep Alabama's offense off the field.
Yeah, whatever you think of Alabama's defense taking a step back or not, I can tell you it's a lot better than Ole Miss's defense. It's a lot better. And Auburn's scoring is in the 30s here in the fourth quarter. the Ole Miss team that Alabama faced would probably have. I think they would have 40 points in this game, judging by the way it's gone. Uh, the other interesting thing, can we slight diversion because this is I think related. Currently, Mississippi State 31, Kentucky 17. Like is we talk about A&M's bad loss at Mississippi State. Is Mississippi State just this weirdly up and down team? Is that what's going on this year?
I mean, they beat NC State on the road by 2 touchdowns. I think they did beat A&M. I think they caught A&M at a good time. I don't think they beat A&M now. But obviously, like this, I don't know if Kentucky's still got guys out defensively, but the one thing I've felt pretty good about Mississippi State the last 2 years is they've got a decent defense. It's overshadowed by the fact that their offense goes 3 and out a lot, and their offense gets off schedule a lot because they throw it 70 times a game. But their defense is pretty good. I mean, one thing that they're pretty good about is keeping everything in front of them. I remember a couple of really good offenses they faced last year, and for a while this year again against A&M and Alabama. They're not giving up the deep ball a lot until maybe they just break. So maybe they've got a decent defense, and sometimes their offense just clicks.
I think so. I mean, there's some truth, and we talked about this with the Georgia game. Kentucky is out, I think, 2 starting defensive linemen now, and they don't have depth. So that for them, that's pretty brutal. Like Overshown was a great player for them, so that may be a part of it. But yeah, I think there is. I think Kentucky, and this is what A&M is, right? Like Kentucky is a team that is a run-first team with some limited ability to throw the ball. Levis is not a bad quarterback, but he's certainly not a dynamic one. And I think Mississippi State may have a really good front. And against those sorts of teams that are maybe more run first, I think it
someone
maybe
said
that they're a good matchup.
Josh, somebody said that Kentucky's not a good team. And I mean, again, can you help me contextualize it in this year? Because the team that's down 3 to Ohio State going close to the fourth quarter lost to Illinois last week. So if we're going to judge Kentucky, don't we have to judge everybody in the context of this year?
Yeah, I mean, look, right? I mean, Kentucky beat Florida, destroyed LSU. The early close games against UT Chattanooga and South Carolina really don't look good. Missouri, but I'll forgive you a 30-13 loss to Georgia. Where do you define good, right?
Right.
And people want to say that one of the things we always hate is people just saying, "Oh, that's not a top 15 team or not a top 10 team in isolation." Like, "Oh, it's crazy you have X as a top 10 team." Have you looked around the landscape? Because there's not really that many teams that there are not many teams people would say are good teams, and lots of people are really happy to say X team sucks. Just not a lot there.
So we have a resident Michigan fan that's wanting to fire Harbaugh, which is funny because today I felt was one of the better coached, better looking Harbaugh teams. Look, defensively, you got to be frustrated because Kenneth Walker ran roughshod over them. But honestly, especially offensively against a good defense, this is the first time I've really been kind of proud of Harbaugh's offense in a long time. So, Josh, what do you think? Like, maybe take a step back and give us your thoughts on that game.
Yeah, and as somebody noted, and I didn't even really realize this, and guys, we're live just like you, and I'm watching multiple games at a time, but I can't watch everything. Kentucky does have 4 turnovers in the game. I get that, but they're being outgained 400 yards to 216. So that's pretty rough. They're actually kind of getting dominated. I'm sorry, repeat your question.
I was just talking about people in the chat saying that Michigan needs to fire Harbaugh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't think that was a poorly run game. Now, it's still, somebody said this, I think it may have been our history teacher friend that's a big Michigan fan, and I'm blanking on the name. It still feels like Harbaugh is trying to play ball control offense. He's still has this idea that you can build a lead and lean on your defense to win a game, and it's not realistic. He doesn't seem to accept the fact that you know, when you build a lead, you need to then step on the throat and put up a 30 to 40 point lead on top of it, right? When you hit 25 and the other team's at 10, then lean on them and hit 30, hit 40. Know that you've got to put games away, and that's the reality of RPO football today. But neither team was moving the ball that well. Thorne was not throwing it very well at all, and it didn't really look like Michigan State had a lot of threat to be explosive and win the game. So I don't really mind the way he called it and ran it. He relied on his strengths, tried not to turn the ball over, and in the kind of way that game was going for most of the game, it seemed like a good strategy. And maybe we should touch on that real quick. Can we as a group accept some points that we were making made sense, which is neither one of those teams had been tested, especially on their defenses had not been tested at all. And that maybe that hype on Peyton Thorne coming into that game might have been at least a little bit exaggerated, because he certainly didn't walk out of that one looking like a Heisman contender, even though they won the game.
Yeah, and the other thing that I want to note about Michigan State is I'm going to talk about their defense. I want you to talk about an offense that relies heavily on a running game. Defensively, they're going to struggle against any team that has balance, or really any team that can throw the ball. That secondary is scary. Michigan's really, when they lost Bell, their wide receiver room really took a hit because they don't have good wide receivers. You saw all the drops today. Those guys were running free all night long. And if the next time they cover a tight end will be the first time, they're going to struggle against a dynamic vertical offense. I don't know if they'll see one other than Ohio State this year, but they're going to struggle. On the flip side, and I hate to do this because this is a big win for them, and they've had a great year, but now we're into talking about like playoff potential because of how deep in the season they are. And what we do, we pee in everybody's Cheerios. On the flip side, Josh, we saw Thorne was not effective today. Talk about how good, not even elite, good defenses in like a playoff level caliber team can really kind of take that away, if that's what you solely rely on.
Yeah, and man, Trayvon Henderson is a different kind of dude, and to your point, having a high level running back makes a big difference. I mean, Kenneth Walker made that game for Michigan State. You can talk about the passing game and everything else, but that was all Kenneth Walker, really, and a lot of the explosives came from him. But in the passing game, I mean, Michigan was pretty aggressive, but 6.5 yards per attempt, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. They didn't throw well. And early in the game, it was like 4.5, 4.8 yards per attempt. They actually increased that at the end of the game. I think the big deal there is when you play a defense that can play consistent man coverage, particularly against the RPO, the man coverage is the way to defend the RPO because your safeties and linebackers don't have as much strain. And at least the easy RPO isn't there. And it's a big difference. And the way you defeat that is you have really high level receivers because they'll beat man coverage. That's why teams with elite receivers win playoffs. But if you don't have that super high level receiving talent, and I mean, Michigan State and Michigan have kind of been slowly improving, lurching forward in that regard. They're not, multiple first round draft picks. They're not what Ohio State is. They're not where Alabama was last year, not where Clemson's been. It's not that anything like that level. It really starts to show up when you play a higher level corners and you slow down. And I think that's a lot what it is.
Charles Haynes with the super chat. Make sure to sign on while you are live so I can give you guys a super chat. Awesome work as always. I picked Michigan State to win. Charles saying I, not me, Daniel. I think we both picked Michigan, though we did pick Michigan State to cover. So that counts. Charles, thank you so much for the super chat. Yeah, I think that talking about our pick in that game, I don't know that we could have picked it really any better than what we said. Like, I think we both said Michigan by 3 or something like that, and the line was 3.5, and we said one play could change this game. We don't see it, any team either side being the favorite. Other than the higher score, didn't that game kind of go how you expected, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. It was higher scoring. I didn't expect the defenses to bend as much as they did.
They broke, Josh. They broke.
Yeah, they broke. And how do you read that, right? Is it the offenses or the defenses? But I'll tell you, we've seen those teams play. Like we saw Michigan State, Indiana, and their 2015. It's a 2015 game, right? So there's plenty of data points of both those teams to suggest the offenses aren't necessarily all world, which makes me really start to suspect that one, the defenses have some weaknesses. Not everybody that has, the failure to play really good passing offenses doesn't mean you're a bad pass defense. It just means you might have a bad or might have issues in pass defense. And I think we saw that in the secondary, really. And weirdly with Michigan, it was almost more like with the run game, but there was a lot of confusion with the tempo, stuff that was hidden. And so, yeah, I agree with it. I kind of almost hate acknowledging it because we're getting kind of spammed, but the minds of conflict keep saying we need to admit that we were completely wrong about Auburn. They're up 11 in the fourth quarter. Ole Miss was driving and threw an interception in the end zone where they were trying to go be down 4. That's not dominating, and we've already touched on it. But
and we've already, I don't. Maybe
that's
he's
the last
saying
I'll
in
say
general. Maybe he's saying in general, and he is. You're getting really close to a timeout because you are spamming our chat pretty hard. In general, we've already said that Auburn has improved far more than we were expected them to after they needed a miracle to beat Georgia State. Like, to say that, like, oh, I told you so. If you were an Auburn fan after the Georgia State game and you said Auburn's going to win out, right? Like, you're saying that not based on any data that you have. You're saying that based on blind homerism. There was some legitimate concern about that game, right? About what we learned from that game with their offense after pairing it with what we saw offensively for them against Penn State. So I want you to touch on this super chat. Charles said, Bama defense may be flawed, but how about credit being ranked 6th in run defense and allowing 1 300-yard passer? Miami and Mississippi State wins looking pretty legit. Josh, as much as we give Alabama's defense a hard time, is it possible to say that Alabama's defense, except for the weird busts that do lead to touchdowns, they're an elite defense?
Yeah, well, that's a big but. I mean, that's a really big but, right? Except for the plays where they give touchdowns, they're elite.
No,
I mean, but
expound on that a little bit, because one of the things that they've been struggling with for the last 3 or 4 years has been that run defense.
Yeah, their defensive line has had a lot of issues. They had real depth problems a couple years ago. They had a bunch of guys get injured, and they were playing at one point starting multiple true freshmen on the defensive line in 2019, like the LSU game where LSU won. And those guys have gotten older. I won't say they've necessarily become superstars, but they've gotten older and better. But they've also kind of found some depth. They've got some young guys in the rotation. One big thing that we've kind of been following for a few years is LeBrian Ray, supposed to be starting for them and kept being in and out of the lineup. And he's finally looks like he's getting healthy, had starting minutes the past couple weeks, and that's been a huge improvement for them. But to your point, Texas A&M had gotten so incompetent in the passing game that teams just never even were almost not defending the pass, right? Like Calzada could not complete a pass against air, literally, just couldn't do it. He was panicking with a clean pocket, couldn't throw to an open receiver. And that was limiting them in other ways. But now that they've gotten any semblance of, just any amount of productivity from the passing game, they've got a really good run game. In Mississippi State, looks like they've got a pretty effective passing game and something of a complementing run game. And so you do start to think, you take the fact that they played Miami with Derek King, they were a little more motivated, a little better. Maybe we all have been a little bit unfair because Alabama did play pretty well defensively in most of those games. Even the A&M game, they had negative plays for reasons other than the defense. So maybe their defense isn't, maybe that criticism was a little bit unwarranted. And I know people took it weirdly when we made the point that Tennessee's a solid team. I don't think any of us were saying Tennessee's like a great team or they necessarily need to be ranked. But that was a team with more time that would have beaten Pitt. I mean, that was a real team, and Alabama the past 2 weeks against Mississippi State and Tennessee sort of swatted them aside like flies. So, I do think they're definitely improving.
And Miami did have enough time to beat Pitt today. Okay, so tell me, like, we'll get into our thoughts on Florida, Georgia in general, but Josh, do you think if Florida didn't go, so it was about to be 3-0 going in a half if Richardson didn't fumble that ball? Maybe he would have found a way to turn the ball over on the ensuing play, maybe. But that was just an absolute epic, something I've never seen kind of meltdown. If that game is 3-0 at the half instead of, I think it was 24-0, do we see JT Daniels in the second half?
Possibly. I'll tell you, I've heard from multiple sources that as of last week, they were considering whether Daniels would play. I've heard that from multiple people, that there was a very good chance Daniels was going to play, or at least they intended to play in multiple snaps. Now, I think the reality is that the fact that Florida built that hole left Bennett in. And the thought, Bennett made a lot of big plays with his legs, and he was very efficient. Anything under 15 yards, would you agree with this? If you have him throw with the same play against the same defense and the throw is within 15 yards and the read's within 15 yards, Bennett is actually considerably better quarterback. Would you agree with that point?
Yes, I agree with that, and the notion that he can do stuff with his legs.
Right. The problem is Bennett over, let's say, 20 to 30 yards, the accuracy just falls off a cliff, and even the decision making falls off a cliff.
I think it's the second part is even worse.
Yeah, and they just didn't really have any reason to have to push it downfield, and they were happy to be efficient. They were happy to move the sticks and wear on them with the run game and with Bennett, and obviously it broke open. But, I mean, can I just say, will people forgive me for taking a little bit of a victory lap? Because I've taken so much crap this year in saying that Richardson is a great athlete and he will be a great quarterback, but he is not and has not been ready to start.
No, I mean, take it because, and maybe give the context of what we've been saying, like about Richardson, because we've been answering questions of Richardson is clearly better. Richardson, if they would have just played them, they'd be undefeated. That sort of thing that we don't understand just how good he was. Talk about it from that point of view.
Yeah, So the problem with Richardson, and schematically watching that Georgia game, it showed up, and even Danielson actually pointed it out at one point, but it was happening the whole game. Georgia realized and knew well on tape, just like we're, amateur armchair quarterbacks, and we'd seen it. So I guarantee you Kirby Smart and Georgia saw it. He does not know how to identify blitzes. He does not know how to read like a hot corner. And if you let someone bring like a cat corner blitz repeatedly and you don't throw the hot read, especially on like first and second down, and take the easy yards, they're just going to keep bringing it. And it's going to be almost impossible to run your defense. I mean, you're not going to block those guys with any frequency. You beat those plays by throwing past it, which should actually give you an easy pass for big chunk plays. What Anthony Richardson can do for you, and it's the same thing we talked about, same reason why they ran this kind of style of offense. He lets you run the ball aggressively. He lets you try to be like a zone read power team and then throw to open guys as a changeup. What he doesn't let you do is be a pass first offense. And when they were leaning on the run with Richardson, I thought they were pretty effective. But the problem I had, and I talked about this leading into it, this was not the game to be a run first team. It just It just wasn't. And
this was actually the game to run the offense they ran against LSU.
Yeah. They needed to be pass first. They needed to take shots downfield. And Jones has a lot of issues. Okay, he makes bad decisions. He's not the runner, but he can make checks, and he's a better thrower. You saw that a little bit at the end of the game. They moved the ball better. But the negative plays, which were all really pretty much all bad decisions on Richardson's part, like we talked about, they're fatal, man. And against inferior competition, like I might say against Kentucky, Richardson might have been a better player to start. Though I debate that because at the time Kentucky was healthier, they were actually really good run defense themselves, and their pass defense is actually pretty suspect. But against inferior teams, Richardson, if you're playing like a G5 especially, I'd rather have Richardson because you can run that guy and he can make plays and he can run the ball and you'll kill him. But when you play a better team that can stop the run, and you've got to be a lot more conscientious about blitzes and that kind of thing, that's where you need someone that understands the play and understands the system. And guys that just run around and create, as much as everybody loves them, if you run around and create without an understanding of the offense and you do it without, I'm not even saying within the offense, right? But if you're not making the right line checks and you're making poor decisions, it usually ends up being more negative than positive.
So I want to make this note. I think that Ole Miss has been inside Auburn's 15-yard line 4 times tonight without points because this is what happens.
It's at least 3.
This is what happens when you go for it every 4th down. You leave yourself so little margin at the end that you have to get touchdowns, which means you start taking risks that you wouldn't otherwise do. Because if you're going down there to keep pace because you've kicked field goals, then you're not throwing crazy balls into the end zone that are getting picked off and you get no points. Instead, they're playing come dig out of a hole mode and they feel like they have to get something. And that's what leads to this sort of thing. So this Lane Kiffin's coaching this year has been absolutely maddening. It shows he has no faith in his defense, even though they've done a respectable job tonight. And it shows me that he's not ready to hold the keys to an Alabama or even an LSU or a USC. There's a joke in there, I'm sure. That level of job because he's still playing Madden with his football team.
Yeah, I had a tweet about this, and I don't know. You guys let me know if this bores you or not in the comments. It takes like 60 seconds for us to see your comments if you didn't realize it. But I really don't buy a lot of the analytics that exists out there on 4th down conversions and points. And the reason for that is I know it's all based off situational data, and it may be based off how good the offense is and the opposing defense. But the problem is, if you're an offensive coach most of the time and it's going for it on 4th down, you only do it when you're really confident you're going to get it. Okay. And so that means all your historical data has this sort of inherent bias to it, right? Because there are all these things we're not tracking, right? Maybe we're not tracking the weather. Maybe we're not tracking momentum. Maybe we're not tracking if you have a star player or a play that you can really rely on. And so coaches make an intelligent decision on whether to go for it on 4th down. And so your stats on the likelihood of conversion are probably a lot better than they really should be, right? There's probably a lot of built-in positivity because coaches are reticent to do it. And I don't, it's sort of like, what's your chance of having a full house when you don't fold, right? It's certainly, or what's your chance of having a full house on a deck of cards? Well, if you're only basing it off the cards that get put on the table, it's going to be a lot higher than it actually is in reality. Because there's a lot of times those coordinators look at their deck of cards and say, do I want to keep playing this and go on 4th down? No, I don't have anything. And they fold, right? And that, I think, really is probably a very hidden bias in all the statistical data. And my big thing is in games where you really need the 4th down conversions and games where you're struggling are probably the games you're least likely to convert it. So even if you get these conversions more often than not, the game where you need the conversions is probably the one game where they don't work for you. So they probably, even if they raise your overall average points scored, it's probably might actually make your chances of winning on the whole loot worse. I don't buy the analytics involved. I think there's too many variables. And in situations like this, I said this a lot with Oregon, like versus Stanford. I've always thought it was a bad idea. Sorry.
Do you think it's the situation though where he feels like he's got an inferior roster and he's playing with one arm tied behind his back relative to his competition, and so he's leaning into the analytics game like Billy Bean at the Oakland Athletics did in Moneyball, because that's where he's going to find that little bit of an advantage he needs to win against a team that's got more talent?
I think so. I think so. Now, a second ago, like you said, I mean, that last one is a little forgivable because of the situation they're in now, being 2 scores and with as little clock left as there is. But that's kind of the the reality that they created by not going for it earlier. I mean, to your point, if they just go for it on 4th down twice, and this is 31-26, doesn't this sound like a hell of a lot closer game?
Well, and their strategy changes entirely. Like,
Yeah.
and that's 31-26 with them going for it and not knowing what would happen in those other 2 trips to the red zone where they turned the ball over or didn't get points because maybe they don't have to throw for a touchdown like crazy cross your body throws in the end zone Hail Mary type of thing.
Right, and to a point someone made, or in the broadcast, I think it was Blackledge. I also want to note another thing. When you talk about those analytics spreadsheets and whether you should go for it on 4th down, those cheats are going to have like 2 sets of stats, right? Like maybe down and distance and score, and you're going to cross-reference the 2 to figure out if you're going to go for it on 4th down. Now, when you come up with the percentages, at best you could do machine learning based on how good your offense is, how good their defense is, and then historical data that's maybe sifted or correlated with those 2 qualities. But the thing that even that misses, because the card is going to have to be pre-printed, right? You can't do that calculation by hand in the stadium, and you're not allowed technology to do it. When Drummond went out of this game, I think that should have really changed the calculus for Ole Miss, because they're trying to do this now with a backup quarterback at receiver. And that's like if Georgia was in a position where Stetson, somebody said in this comments, and I think it's true, it's like if Stetson Bennett was having to play receiver for Georgia, you probably shouldn't be going for it on 4th down a lot, because your odds of somebody not running the right route or dropping a ball are probably pretty high, not getting open. I wouldn't rely on that. I would try to take the points where I could get them. And I'm with you. Like, I think Kiffin's almost taken the opposite, and I think it's a serious mistake.
So somebody said, is it time to start JT Daniels? Josh, there's 2 schools of thought here. And one is save him, and it makes it really hard to prepare. It's like when Alabama dumped Jalen Hurts on Georgia in the middle of the SEC championship game, and they completely kind of didn't know how to defend it because they had planned all week for Tua. There's that school of thought that says, like, man, you got an opportunity. You got a huge opportunity here to like keep that ace in your pocket and somebody's got to prepare for both at best. And then there's the other school of thought that the guy needs reps to be ready to play a team that's got, on par talent with them. Which one do you think that Georgia should be taking?
I am not surprised that they didn't start JT Daniels. I'll say funny comment. SMU would beat Josh hands down. That's true. That's not true. I have never lost a college football game personally.
That's true.
Never.
And you certainly never lost to a G5. Come on.
Right. Yeah. No. I think now it might be time to start JT Daniels. And even in the conversations with people that were sort of telling me what was going on at Georgia, there were a lot of leaks, a lot of rumors going around with it. I made the point that if it were me, knowing where Florida was at, I would be really hesitant to play him in that game. And I think that was fair, right? Like we talked about, if it went to the half 3-0, I think they would have considered starting JT Daniels, because they knew it was just going to take one drive to lose the game, right? When you have 3 points. But once it sort of happened where, and there's, big play for Penn State. I don't know if this is coming back or not, but they might have just had a defensive touchdown that took the lead. The Georgia had a big lead. What they didn't need were turnovers that resulted in points. And I know he had a couple arm punts, but downfield arm punts are just punts, right? So those weren't killers. They were getting first downs. They were moving the ball. And as long as they did that, they were going to win the game. And why transition to a different quarterback who hasn't played in a while? I don't know how much he's even practiced, and take a risk in that game that you were, as I put it to the guy I talked to, I said, look, here, my view is if Georgia plays their B- game, they win, even if Florida brings their A game. That's where I stood with that game. I think those were my exact words to him. I said, why bring in a quarterback that you haven't seen and risk that he's rusty and you get your D game? Because I thought, Georgia's D game might have gotten them beat. Maybe if you bring your D game, you get beat. But if you just play a B- game, which Stetson Bennett could give Georgia, that was enough. I do think, though, if you want to win a national championship, you're going to be trying to beat Alabama and Ohio State and probably somebody else in a semifinal. And you need to be trying to be a little bit better than B- Georgia. And I think maybe you do need to start bringing JT Daniels in and get him reps and get him prepared. Because, and maybe this is where we transition a little bit. I don't think we've necessarily been wrong to question how dynamic Georgia's offense really is with Bennett. Because I would worry against a high scoring offense if they would be able to keep pace absent lots of defensive turnovers or offense creative mistakes.
Look, and that's the thing, like non-turnover aided offense in this game against Florida yielded 3 points in the first half. And I think that for all of the discussion about Stetson Bennett, JT Daniels, and all the heat that we've gotten this week, because we said, what did we say all week? We said Georgia's going to win this game. They're going to put up 30-something points, but is that their ceiling? And we just got all kinds of hate. And look, maybe, and the Georgia fans are going to say, look, we didn't have to do anything offensively today either. We could have scored 107 points if we wanted to. But if Florida isn't absolutely bonkers inept at quarterback in the first half, that is a 3-0 game going into the half. So right now, all the Georgia fans that wanted to get at us this week, they can shut it for a little bit. And look, I still think Georgia's got something in the tank offensively. What we've said all year, Josh, is not that they can't do it, that it's an incomplete, and we need to see it first. At some point, walks like a duck, talks like a duck. You're going to have to show me, because all you've seen at this point is that they can't do anything more than that 37-ish threshold. Josh, on this, though, the fact that we're still not seeing JT Daniels, does that tell you that he's actually hurt to the point that even if he comes back, it might hinder him, kind of like we've seen with Sean Clifford?
Yeah, the SMU just lost, by the way.
Which is huge, and we need to talk about that after this question.
Yeah, I do think, I fully believe JT Daniels is hurt. He's hurt. He's got a lingering injury. I don't think he's 100%. I don't think he can throw normally. It's a matter of when he can be brought along, and somewhat, balancing it with the efficiency with Bennett. Look, as I said, I always expected Georgia's B- game would win. I was honestly a little surprised by the lack of offensive production that Georgia really had against Florida. I wasn't shocked, but there were a lot of unforced points there. I mean, you can give credit for stripping the ball from Richardson. Maybe, that's also a little bit on Richardson. The pick six, though, that was Richardson. And the other interception he threw, like drilled a linebacker that tips it to another guy, that's also on Richardson. You kind of get gifted those. There's a super chat that's directly on this point. And Jermaine Jones made the point that Georgia does not need to score 40, period. The defense does exist. That's been our question all year, right? I mean, our point has been, look, it's fair to be a little critical, or maybe even fairly critical, of Georgia's offense. But Georgia fans hear that, and we make this point of, is Georgia a 40-point offense? I don't know that they are, and there's a lot of reason to think they haven't been. I made the point that they have not scored 3 first-half offensive touchdowns in like any of their 5 or 6 main, I say main or real, like non-G5, not Vandy or Mizzou, South Carolina games. None of them they score 3 first-half touchdowns, right? They've gotten some defensive touchdowns a couple times, but they're not scoring. They're scoring like 14 points in the first half. I don't know if that's viable to win a championship. Most years, I would say no, because the way modern rules are broken, a elite high-level offense is going to score 30-plus points, probably going to score 40 points against almost anybody. You can't play defense well enough. The game is broken. There's things they can do that are kind of indefensible, and they can do enough of it. I don't know that any team in the country, like watching Ohio State right now, is at that level. Right? I just don't know if anyone is at that level. So I'm not sure they need to be a 40-point a game offense, but people need to sort of separate the two, right? It's fair to question whether Georgia's a 40-point a game offense, which is what we're doing. we still have Georgia number one, and it's because we don't personally, and I think you may be the same opinion. I don't really think they need to be a 40-point a game offense to
I
win.
don't know.
But if you don't have that chip, it does mean you have the potential to lose. If they had that chip, I would think they would be the dominant favorite to win the national title.
Right.
But without it, it does leave an option for people to beat them.
I don't think that, based on what I've seen from Ohio State tonight, I don't think that they could score enough. I think the SEC championship game is honestly Georgia's national championship. I'm saying it right now. Like, Ohio State fans, they might see a win in this game and get mad at me for saying it, but I don't think that. I think Penn State's offense is good, or defense is good. Georgia's is a whole other tier better. And you might get in the 24-ish range with Ohio State's offense from what I've seen tonight. The only team that I think has a prayer of scoring in the 30s on Georgia probably is Alabama. I will say, I keep going back to 2016 Alabama. They had, in the playoff era, probably the best defense by a pretty good clip. Now, Clemson had that great defensive line for a couple of years, but in terms of defense, look at their two deep. I think the number is like, I think I said 18 players on that two deep are in the NFL right now, which is insane. And that defense gave up like 35, 37 to Clemson. And it was because their offense stalled. And that's what I think Georgia fans don't really appreciate is if your offense isn't getting it done, it can make your defense give up points.
Yeah, if your offense isn't scoring much, I mean, even if you don't need a ton of points, if you're not moving the ball and not scoring much, it really frees the other team up to take shots downfield. And frankly, Florida doesn't have the capacity to do that, either really at receiver or quarterback. There are teams that do. Now, Georgia's pass rush is awesome. Like, Carter is a great defensive lineman. I mean, obviously Davis is phenomenal. It's hard to get off a lot of downfield shots, but you can try 3 or 4 or 5 and get off 1 if you don't really need to score many points. So it does definitely change the game quite a bit. I think Joseph L had one. Yep, the Heisman race is wide open. I know one name that's definitely going to be really high on the list right now, and that's going to be Kenneth Walker. Do you agree?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, it's not just that he's got good stats. He put up a monster game in the biggest game. And this is one really benefit to the thing that I hate the big noon kickoff is like the biggest Big Ten game because it deserves a better time slot, but it does ensure that everybody's watching it. And it's doubly insured because there was no SEC early games today. I think there's a lot of bye weeks or something this week. So everybody saw him do that. And the reputation or the ranking of being somewhere in that top 3 or top 5 is certainly worth it. Josh, I want to talk about this SMU game because I want to talk about what does it mean that a lot of people really wanted SMU to stay ranked so that it would help Cincinnati's case in the playoffs. Doesn't that say a lot in and of itself about how easy a path a G5 has to the playoffs?
I mean, maybe there's a lot of complications to that ideology, right? I mean, I do think there's a lot of people that say this is the year we've got to let the G5 into the playoffs. Look how crazy it is. And I've said before on here, I hate that with a passion. Like, it's not the whole idea of, well, we got to give G5 a slot this time. No, you give a team a slot. Cincinnati's not the G5. Cincinnati's Cincinnati. Cincinnati has Cincinnati's schedule. And they've dominated enough teams that I don't have a problem, and I've had them very high in my rankings. I do. I have, but SMU didn't become a worse team by not being ranked because they verified that they weren't a great team by losing to Houston.
Right.
But they're going to be the same team either way, whether they're ranked or unranked. It's really just that people desperately want to see someone else in there and they want to see a G5. And frankly, it's a lot of wishful thinking that Cincinnati is going to get there and win. The thing that I love about college football, like us or other people, you can talk about how great you think a team is or should be all you want. They still got to show up and win the game, right? And it doesn't matter what I say about Cincinnati or think or what you say. They've like if they get in the playoff, they're going to have to win or lose. The problem I have is I think people want to force Cincinnati to be in just for the sake of having Cincinnati in there. And it is a much easier path for a G5 to get in the playoff. So one, I think they could get in by being undefeated against a schedule that, an Alabama would just cakewalk or Georgia. And people might laugh about Alabama, but if Alabama loses to Georgia in the SEC championship, they're going to be out. And It's almost absurd that they'd be out for that and Cincinnati would be in, given the differences in schedule. And people would laugh about the A&M loss, but A&M is a lot better. A&M is a lot better potentially than anybody on Cincinnati's schedule. Maybe,
and it's in a stretch. That's the
maybe
thing.
Not Notre Dame. I don't know.
That's the thing that I talk about. That G5's path to the playoff doesn't include, like, the way you talk about math all the time. Like, if you have a 75% chance to beat 5 teams, but you play all 5 in a row, the odds of you losing to one of them goes up tremendously. So with a G5 who doesn't have that stretch that could, like, let's say you are a good G5, but you don't have that stretch to really test you. There's something to be said about having to get up week in and week out and playing an SEC team or a Big Ten team. Even if they're not considered great, they would probably be, 10-2 with a G5 schedule. So that's what frustrates me, is like the other, really in the back of their mind, what people are saying is they're either insulted by the fact that you're saying Alabama would walk that schedule, and they're saying, this is it's a hard schedule for a G5. Well, that implies that you're not good enough to be in the playoffs. Just because it's like what you're saying is, okay, this team has all these disadvantages because they're not as good as everybody else. So let's assume that this is hard for them when it wouldn't be hard for other teams. Doesn't that imply that you're not an elite team?
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, the reality is people they want them in the playoff for the sake of having them in the playoff. They don't think about what's going to happen. People genuinely don't care whether or not they deserve it based off the resume and how they did against it. Well, some people would say they do because they've won all their games. Not whether those games were hard or whether they deserve it given the massive disparity in scheduling, but they won all their games. What they certainly don't really care about is, are they actually have any realistic shot of winning the playoff if they were placed in it? Because you can't just win one game now. You got to win 2. We've talked about this a lot. You get in one game and a one-off in like in a bowl or something, and sometimes weird things happen. You get advantageous matchups. Bowls, people really aren't always motivated at the same level. Or maybe stuff goes your way. Maybe a G5 wins, a high-level G5 wins a one-off championship that way if they're placed in it. A playoff where you've got to do that back-to-back, way less likely. Like way, way, way less likely. Because if you think about it being like, well, you got a 15 or 20% chance. Okay, well, if you got a 20% chance of winning each game, that's a 1 in 5 chance, right? What's a 20% chance doubled? 1 in 25.
Right.
It's a 4% chance. So you're going to go 25 years before anybody wins a title. If you've got a 20% chance of winning each playoff game, it's going to take you 25 years on average to win it. And I think that's maybe a little bit where Cincinnati is even this year. I don't think they have a realistic shot of winning those, like beating Georgia and Ohio State back to back. It's not gonna happen.
And I know transitive property doesn't really work in college football, and I don't think it does on an isolated situation. But we've got multiple games where Cincinnati's kind of struggled by teams that have been floored. Today was no different. They had an ugly win against Tulane, who lost to Ole Miss 61-41 or 61-21. They lost by 40 points. That's the difference in the kind of team that a Power 5 schedule has to play, where right now Alabama's really not getting a lot of credit for beating Ole Miss by 3 touchdowns, right? Alabama will get less credit for beating the team that beat Tulane by 40 points by 3 touchdowns than Cincinnati will get for struggling in a win against Tulane, which is the double
I know
standard
the
that's
final
crazy.
score was I know the final score was high, but that was a late blowout. They struggled the majority of that game and earnestly struggled. I'll say it that too. Well, Oklahoma also struggled with Tulane, right?
Yeah, 5-point win, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Josh, tell me, let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Tell me what your thoughts are. We've got, I don't know how much time left in this Ohio State game. Like, anything changed in your mind for Ohio State now that it's a 6-point lead over Penn State?
Well, it's the same thing I said at the start here. A lot of my concerns about Ohio State from earlier in the year remain. My concerns that Ohio State scheduling did get a lot weaker. I know. Is it fair to say this? You were a lot more reassured about Ohio State's offense than I was.
Yes and no. I mean, I said what I wanted to see against Indiana was a step forward. And I do think even tonight, I think this Ohio State offense looks better than what we saw against teams like who was it, Tulsa, that they had 20 points going into the fourth quarter. What we saw against Oregon, which was a highly inefficient offense. Like, even tonight, they're not blowing it out. They don't have 50 points, but their offense is better. I'm still not sold that they can score what they need against Georgia.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of where I'm at. Offenses can be a lot better than what I've seen from almost anyone nationally, and they're just not. I mean, Ohio State. One of the big things here is they've had some big explosive runs, but the consistent running game hasn't been there. And the thing I talked about early in the year, Stroud is flashing inconsistencies again. There've been a lot of off the mark throws in this game. A lot of it comes down to pressure and footwork. It's easy for a quarterback to throw accurately when you're dominating a game, you're comfortable, and especially when there's no pressure because it's so easy to set your footwork when you know you're not going to be rushed. Not just when you're not rushed, but you know it's not going to happen. It's easy to focus on your drops. When you start feeling the rush and when you know it's coming, then you get a little choppier and you're not really in a position to focus as much on making sure your fundamentals are correct, and it starts to fall apart. So the reversion to that, I mean, if they win the game, they win the game for now, right? But I'm just talking about projecting them out for a championship level, which is a very different evaluation, is tough. One thing, so Auburn did win the game. You want to talk a little bit about sort of the realities of the SEC West race now going forward? Because I think it's a little
I mean, it comes down to
interesting
the
and
Iron Bowl, right?
difficult.
Well, I will
Difficult to
say Auburn's still
evaluate.
got to beat A&M, right? I mean, that's going to be an interesting game, a higher profile game than we really expected a few weeks ago. So whoever wins that game needs Alabama to lose, right? Either A&M is pulling for Auburn to beat Alabama, or Auburn is pulling for Auburn to beat Alabama. But isn't that the reality of the SEC West right now? Like, unlike Georgia, who maybe they clinched today. I know they had a chance to clinch based on some certain factors. Unlike Georgia, I think Alabama's chances to lock down the SEC West are going to come down to the Iron Bowl.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting point. Let's assume Auburn loses to Texas A&M, okay? And then let's assume that Texas A&M wins out the rest of the year. And that Auburn beats Alabama, okay? That leaves Texas A&M with 2 SEC losses to Arkansas and to Mississippi State. Auburn has lost twice to Georgia and Texas A&M, and Alabama will have lost twice to Texas A&M and Auburn, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Auburn wins the SEC West because one of their losses was to an East opponent.
Right.
And it's the 3-way tiebreaker rules. So the interesting point here that I'm not sure people have fully appreciated is that Auburn can actually, this Auburn A&M game is only an elimination game for A&M. It doesn't eliminate Auburn at all. And even if Auburn loses to A&M, and they beat Alabama, they win the West almost no matter what, right? Because if they win out, because even the three-way, they win the three-way tiebreaker, and two-way, then it's just head-to-head, so they win that tiebreaker too because they beat Alabama. So, yeah,
I think,
the beating Ole Miss puts them in a position where they can win the West now.
and I think that honestly, like if Auburn beats A&M and Alabama, they deserve it, right? Like
Well, I
that's
mean, yeah, I mean, I think that should be clear, right? That would be really interesting because we were ragging on them in Penn State when they lost that game close to Penn State. And we were ragging on them. Look, I don't think it was unjustifiable. I mean, they very, very, very nearly lost to Georgia State. And can we take a step back and talk about how crazy it is that it was like a fourth down Hail Mary throw to beat
mhm,
Georgia State, right?
mhm.
And
Yeah,
now
from the
they've
backup
beaten Ole
quarterback.
Miss and gotten the record. That's a crazy turnaround. And I think you've got to give a lot of credit to what Brian Harsin has been able to get out of that team.
I'm
I think
honestly, I'll be honest. I'm more impressed with the Arkansas win last week than I am this week with Ole Miss. Mainly because Ole Miss is just they got nothing left in the tank. Like this is a brutal stretch for them. They're totally banged up. I predicted Auburn to win this game. I don't think Auburn is a better team than a healthy Ole Miss, but the Arkansas game was comfortable, and to me that was pretty impressive. And that indicates to me more that they've come a long way than the win tonight.
I think the biggest thing for Auburn is that they've accepted who Bo Nix is. They are not asking Bo Nix to do a lot of reads or progressions. They're not asking him to throw a lot. They are. It's pretty clear to me. They are telling him, if you got a guy open, throw it. Otherwise, just run the ball. Like they let him run a lot, and it's on scrambles. And they've accepted that he's not a consistent, accurate thrower, and that he's an athlete. But I think the difference between them and Malzahn is Malzahn always tried to make him run Malzahn's system. They didn't really let him be a runner. They certainly didn't let him be a run first quarterback in like a zone read power attack. And I think Harsin has just embraced who he is. They're playing to their limitations a lot more, and they've really made that adjustment. I think that started with the Arkansas game and some of the plays they made. But and I worry saying this to make a lot of Auburn fans mad here. It's also kind of true that Auburn with their schedule has been a little lucky, a little benefited by when they played which teams. Like Arkansas was not as good when KJ Jefferson got hurt, and after the Georgia game, I think they were pretty dispirited. Ole Miss is nothing like the team they were early in the year. Would you agree with me that if they had played Arkansas and Ole Miss and Georgia back to back, because they played Georgia, Arkansas, and Ole Miss in a row, and it's impressive they won those three in a row. Now they've got to go win again at A&M next week. That's a pretty brutal stretch. But if they played that early in the year, I could easily see them losing Georgia and at least one of Arkansas or Ole Miss, and they might well beat Texas A&M because of where they were in a quarterback situation. But it's really interesting to me how much the scheduling has played a role here. I think in how certain teams have gone up and certain teams have gone down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also bad luck for maybe A&M, like that they played Mississippi State when they did. Get out, get out, get out, get out, get out. Just just tied it up. Just tied it up. Sorry. So the thing is, like, this is why, Josh, and maybe this is why it's hard for college football fans to balance this, but this is why we always preach this. Every game matters. We want to look at the momentum trending towards the end of the year and weight that in a certain way, but there's only 12 games. So we can't say that you lost in week 1 and you put it all together, so we're going to kind of forget that game, which we are doing a little bit with Ohio State. Like, how do you balance that? Like, how do you balance the fact that maybe teams are better versus maybe they are who they are and that they just hit a good stretch of favorable opponents?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I've always said if you win a game, I'm going to kind of assume you win it every time. The way I look at schedules, and the only way I think to be fair is to look at how you did against your schedule, look at somebody else did against their schedule, and say, okay, if you trade schedules, how would you do with their schedule? How would they do with your schedule? But the one thing I always say is if you beat a team, I'm going to just generally assume you're going to always beat them. And I don't think I'm not going to punish Auburn for playing teams in a certain order or a certain way. I've always thought like scheduling. I mean, again, A&M, like it's helped them a lot against Ole Miss. Isn't this true, right? Ole Miss early in the season was tremendously better with Texas A&M. We both agree on that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Would you also agree with me that right now Texas A&M is probably a good bit better than Ole Miss?
Yeah, and absolutely. And scheduling has both hurt and helped A&M in that, Calzada wasn't ready by the time they lost to Arkansas and Mississippi State, but he would probably beat both of those teams now. But also, they caught Alabama in the middle of a brutal stretch, and Alabama probably was so focused on Ole Miss and didn't take them seriously or whatever. Like they still, that loss still totally counts. I'm just saying, I think that they kind of benefited and got hurt both sides.
So we have been talking about this for a while. People are kind of calling it out on us that we called a blowout Ohio State win. So when it gave us, OJ Yoder gave us the $2 super chat just to talk about the Big Ten. Maybe we need to, and for the people that are, I think a lot of these people probably only got on later. We talked about this Ohio State Penn State game for like 20 minutes at the beginning of this. Yeah. And I think you guys just sort of missed that. But maybe we do want to tie it back here as Ohio State is trying to score a touchdown here with 3 minutes left to put the game away. But it has stayed a close game. A player stepping out of bounds is the only reason that Penn State doesn't have the lead right now.
You know who does have the lead right now? The freaking Braves. Okay, continue.
Hey, man.
I'll
chop on. But I mean, like, how do you take this away? I mean, were we totally off base?
No.
How were we wrong?
So I think we said like 38-20 or something like that.
I'm going to pull up our scores because I don't even remember.
But the thing that I think that we were wrong-ish on is how Ohio State would get their points. Ohio State has not consistently driven the ball tonight. It hasn't been a fluid offense. It's been kind of a clunky offense that's hit some big plays that were very timely. And I'm, those count, especially against a good defense. I think we expected to see the efficiency there. But in all reality, I think it's kind of a good thing for Ohio State because what do we see against Oregon? And what have we seen a lot this year? A bunch of yards, but not a bunch of points. And so I think in this case, like also showing that you can hit the really big run, the really big pass is something that was missing against Oregon that they needed to win that game. And they've had it tonight. And look, everybody's going to say Penn State lost to Illinois and then gave Ohio State a game. I think there is some data there that maybe says if Ohio State played Georgia today, they would not win. But there's also some we got to keep it real and understand that Penn State does have a good defense, a very good defense that Ohio State's put up 30 on, probably whatever they get on this drive, 33, 37. So it's Ohio State.
Well, and they also had their best linebacker ejected.
Yeah. I think, Josh, would you say, like, if this game ended 30-24, Ohio State's not going to get enough credit for beating a Penn State team that everybody is equating to worse than Illinois?
I mean, if that's the point that they're the team that lost Illinois, because Illinois was a bad errant loss. Like Illinois is not a better team than Penn State. I never thought they were. We've talked about a lot that if you're a team that leans on having a really good defense and you don't have much scoring, you can lose. We talked about it that week with somebody. You can very easily lose any game where you're struggling to hit 20 points. And right now, how many points does Penn State have in this game? 24 points, right?
24.
You can't consistently win these. And that's our concern with Georgia too, to be fair, is you can't consistently win games if you're scoring like 20, 25 points. There's just way too many ways to lose. And that's what happened with the Illinois game. But yeah, I mean, but the reason that I disagree with you, and oddly enough, somebody just gave a super chat, Larry did, I give him credit. He hates on us, but he always shows up and he supports us. So I appreciate that. The point I was going to make is, yeah, but if they don't get a strip sack, they're losing this game right now, right? I mean, the way they've won it hasn't been by dominating it. I mean, the Penn State has moved the ball really well, better than I expected they'd move the ball, frankly. I thought Clifford at times has been more effective than I anticipated. That's not been. I mean, he's right now 7 yards per. 7 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. They've thrown 45 passes, but they've shown some ability to move the ball, to get yardage. The concern is, again, though, 33 yards rushing in the game. Noah Cain has 13 yards. Lovett has 20. They're being outgained by a significant margin. It's 458 to 350. It's not just like it's a strip sack. But it is kind of weird, right? Penn State has 3 turnovers to Ohio State's 1. Ohio State's outgaining them by 108 yards. And I'm leading to a point here. I know I'm rambling a bunch. I know you're watching the Braves game, but I'm rambling a bunch.
You can ramble all you want. I'm preoccupied.
The point I'm leading to, isn't this the thing we talked about a lot with Ohio State? They are not very good about converting their yardage to points. They leave a lot of yards on the field. They have a lot of chunk plays that don't go anywhere because they're not super consistent. They have a lot of penalties. Stroud, a couple drives ago was missing guys in the end zone. There are a lot of inconsistencies with this offense to where, yeah, there's explosiveness, but it doesn't quite translate as well as it should.
So Larry wants us to give props to the Penn State offense. I'm not really going to do that. I mean, it's fine. 24 points is not going to beat an elite team. Where I'm giving Penn State props is the defense. I think the defense showed up tonight, and the defense has showed up all year. But you got 24 points, which is, okay. But it really goes back to, what do Penn State fans want to be? And if you want us to assess your team as a team that really what the Penn State brand commands, or do you want us to just be nice about, 24 points in a loss is nice for a 15-ish best team in the country? Like, I can do that, but I mean, that's an insult to Penn State's brand. And so I'm not going to do that. Somebody else, Nick Savage, gave us a super chat just to make Larry go away, which is funny. We love Larry. He gives a lot, and we take and give back. He's been around for a while, and we love the Penn State fans that give us a hard time. Look, Penn State played a great game tonight. I think they played a little bit over their heads. They did not pack it in after the loss last week, which we didn't think they would. And the defense really showed up, and I was really impressed. So that's really, really all I got to say about that.
Yeah, all I got to say about that. I mean, the reality, we're really right now trying to mainly evaluate how is Ohio State going to do when they have to face Michigan State and Michigan back to back to end the year, right? And then they're going to have to play in the Big Ten championship, and they're going to have to play semifinal. Then they have to play final. You've got probably 4 more ranked games left on this calendar. That all matters. And what we're talking about right now isn't that Ohio State isn't a good team or something. It's that we're picking at them because we know how difficult all this is. And look, let's be real. Maybe outside Oregon and Penn State, it's quite possible none of the other defenses may end up in like the top 65 in terms of advanced stats. Indiana was good. They haven't been great without their corners. I don't know where they're going to end up. I think there's some flaws on that defense generally. I could go into better depth about that schematically, but there's some stuff with the way they play that it's not going to translate against better competition. But Ohio State has a very backloaded schedule. And so you can't just throw out the 2 Oregon. This is my problem. I mean, do you agree with this, right? I have an issue with people saying, well, other than the Oregon and Penn State game, we've scored 1,000,000 points and we lead the country in scoring, because those two games are kind of the two defenses that are good enough to strain you. And the rest of them were some of the weakest. I mean, it was a backloaded schedule with the weakest teams you could play. Like you do have to concede that the schedule was built such that your points are pretty inflated, especially when you're running it up on like Akron.
Yeah, I mean, you don't hit any scaling issues against Maryland, against Akron, against any of these teams. No scaling issues at all. So that does matter. And somebody said this is Penn State Super Bowl, but like, look, you are everybody's Super Bowl when you're in the playoffs because it's the de facto Super Bowl. Like, so, and people are saying Penn State's prepared longer for this game. Like, look, you're going to get prep time for whoever you play in the first round of playoffs is going to have all the tape, all the everything they need on you, all of it. So just be prepared for that.
And
Jermaine said that Georgia 37.8 points per game were not Penn State. Like, I don't think anybody's saying you are. Maybe you're not. Maybe that's a different chat that you're having on the sideline. But I don't think anybody thinks that Georgia and Penn State are the same team.
I think we talked about like Ohio State scoring on Georgia versus Penn State or whatnot. I think it was more a positive for Georgia, right? Which maybe that's his point. I think what he's saying is, hey, if you're struggling to score 35 on Penn State, that's great with Penn State's offense being Penn State. But if you score 35 on Georgia, you may not win the game. Maybe that's what he's saying.
Maybe Georgia. I want to see. I mean, you had 30 on Kentucky's defense. So
I mean, Ohio State's run defense has stepped up tremendously. And again,
here's an interesting thing for me. Ohio State's offensive line play hasn't been great tonight. Georgia's offensive line is really good. So does it surprise you that they're not running it better?
Yeah. But again, this goes back. Well, one, Florida's defense was underrated. They have a crap ton of transfers, and they finally gelled, and they're playing better football, and that's a good run defense. But two, and we say this all the time, a good defense, I don't mean great, I don't mean elite, a good defense can stop the run. Now, they may completely break against the pass, but any good or better defense is capable of stopping the run if they sell out to it. The way football works, if you stack numbers at the line of scrimmage and you play cover zero, you're going to stop the run if you're decently good, because you're going to have constant numbers advantages. So that didn't shock me. The problem with Georgia, and this is what we're talking about, like Daniels versus Bennett versus the other guys, you need to have a fastball you can throw or some other, basically you got to have some other pitch. Like if you've got the run game and you rely on it totally, you're going to face teams that can stop the run. I don't care almost how good you are running the ball. Somebody can stop the run, and you've got to be able to throw to make them get out of the formations that allow them to stop the run. And so I'm not shocked that they have had issues running a ton super successfully. But I think my thing is aggressive as, again, Florida was bringing like blitzing a ton of guys, Grantham super aggressive. They haven't been more effective than they were passing in spite of that. I think that's the bigger concern. But again, it's a limited concern when your defense is as good as it is, right? I mean, it's just one side of the ball, and it's all theoretical if they're ever going to need those points.
So I can do a top 10 right now. I don't know if you're semi-prepared to do one. I've already prepped one to give you some time. So what do you think about
that? Sure. I tried to prep it earlier, and I kind of got bogged down. I had a hard time doing it, so I'll probably use yours almost as a cheat sheet to do my own because I was having so much trouble with it.
My number 10 is my favorite. Y'all, these are so hard. Top 10, and again, I'm going to keep saying this is what has made this season so fun. Top 10s are so unbelievably hard. So let's get into it. I'm going to clap for the cut up. All right, so for me on top 10, number 1, I've got Georgia, which is pretty obvious. I have some concerns about their offense, about what I saw today, but the defense is so good that it may not even matter the entire year. Number 2, I've got Alabama. And What people are going to say is Ohio State, assuming they hold on, there's about a minute and a half left in this game. Assuming they hold on, they've got another ranked win or whatever. But after this game, Penn State's not going to be ranked. This is a home game that Penn State was very much in. And we just had this discussion, very much in, and could have won this game. I think Alabama beats Penn State by probably about 17 points. It's not a fair transitive property thing. I'm just right now, I think Alabama's playing a little better than Ohio State. Number 3, I do have Ohio State ahead of number 4, Cincinnati. I think Ohio State would beat Cincinnati pretty handily, which is unfortunate because I think Cincinnati has kind of got a free and easy path to the playoffs, even though they're not really crushing their schedule, which I wanted to see. I thought after the Central Florida game, they had kind of turned the corner and we were going to see them really get some momentum. We haven't seen that. They struggled 7-point win with Navy, 31-12, but it was really uglier than that against Tulane today. So that's been a little disappointing, but they are still winning. I've got Michigan State at number 5, and this one is kind of academic because they play Ohio State. So that will really sort itself out. So it doesn't really matter where they're at, 3, 5. I think the win today was a really good win. So much so that I still have Michigan in my top 10. I know those two teams haven't really played anybody except each other, but I think that was a really good win. And I like them at 5. I'm really concerned for them at quarterback. Number 6, this is where people are going to laugh at me, and this is where I'm going to say in the comments, if you're going to laugh at me about this, you got to tell me who you put in your top 10 so I can laugh at yours as well. It's easy to pick on without understanding just how hard this is to do in this year. People are going to point out, because I've got Texas A&M at number 6, how flawed they are, how the losses they have, how they're bad or whatever. Tell me who you're going to put ahead of them that's good enough to beat Alabama, and then we'll talk. Number 7, I've got Oklahoma back in my top 10. I said, last week when I had them out, I was punishing them for the Kansas game. I still am kind of punishing them for that. They've got a lot of one-score wins against teams that are getting blown out by bad teams. And so that is still a concern. Texas Tech is rudderless at this point. They got murdered by Texas. They're not a good team, but they handle their business for once in a while. So I appreciated that. Number 8 is Oregon. And that could change at any moment. I haven't been hugely impressed with Oregon, but they do have the best win of the college football season, them or Texas A&M, depending on how you look at it. Number 9, I've got Michigan. I thought they played a great game today. It was a road game. They very well, if something here or there went their way, that could have ended up in a blowout because they could have changed how Michigan State had to play their game offensively, forced them to throw the ball a lot more. And it didn't happen. But I have them at number 9 and number 10. And this is where college football fans really need to pay attention because Cincinnati and Notre Dame are right there on the cusp of taking playoff slots. I've got Notre Dame at number 10, and it's hard to argue with at this point because if philosophically, if you say losing to elite teams isn't that bad, their only loss is to a top 5 team. And it was a really close game. Now, you may not think a lot about Cincinnati, but if you don't think a lot about them, then drop them even further. But right now, Notre Dame has one loss. It's against a top 5 team. They won today by double digits against North Carolina. They don't have anybody on their schedule other than Cincinnati to prove that they're a good team. But until they lose a game, I can't keep them out of the top 10 because everybody else is losing. Kentucky lost. Iowa lost. So I got to do something there, and that's what I did. All right, Josh, I'm going to watch some baseball, even though I'll probably interrupt you here or there and let you do your top 10.
Yeah, and like you, this is extremely difficult to do. And do you want to honestly, I think this year in particular has been really difficult because so many of the teams that you feel like are comfortably in the top 10 lose the week of. Like we have Kentucky in the top 10 last week, and they have a bad loss to I say bad loss to Mississippi State. Maybe Mississippi State's good. I do worry, and I'll say this at the onset, I do worry that we're punishing conferences for beating themselves up, and I want to be careful about that. That Mississippi State, Kentucky, You got like Arkansas beats Texas. The fact that they're all losing to each other doesn't necessarily mean they're all worse than teams in like the Big Ten, right? If we could go be it could literally be that if the 10 best teams in the country are in the SEC, okay? I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying it could be. That they all go 500 against each other, and they all have in the season with 2 or 3 losses, and they could still be better than everybody else in college football. And that's just the regional nature and the difference in scheduling. But I have to assume that's not entirely true, and there weren't enough data points for me to overturn it. So I kind of end up with the list I'm about to roll through. Number 1, I have Georgia. I'm in the same boat as you. Georgia continues to win in dominant fashion. The defense is far and away the best in the country. The offense is very efficient. The running game's good. I'm not in love with the offense, but given the defense, I think their offense is like primarily because of the running game is something like a top 15, top 25 offense. It's about where it's at. But the defense is so far and away number 1, and the rest of the country is so far behind that I think it's enough. Enough to make him a clear number 1. My number 2, and I'm same as you, it's Alabama. The reality is they lost to Texas A&M. That seemed like a bad loss. I said at the time I didn't feel like A&M was going to finish unranked. I don't think they are going to finish unranked. Everybody, especially Oklahoma and Texas fans, really want to say A&M sucks. They don't. And it's kind of funny that the first
they do want to say that.
The first unranked loss of Saban's tenure may actually end up being one of the highest ranked teams with the highest final ranking that he's ever lost to. But we don't. What was it? South Carolina, maybe 2010. I'm not sure they even finished very highly ranked. But I think that's kind of a misnomer. Ohio State's number 3. They slip a little bit to me. Alabama goes up almost by default. Ohio State resurfaced a lot of the concerns I had for them early in the year. Give credit to Penn State, but still, that offense is not at the super elite level that Ohio State fans wanted to convince themselves of. Clearly, it can't just put up 40 points automatically. At the very least, it's possible to slow them down. I have Cincinnati number 4. I think you got to be impressed with what they're doing. Not only the undefeated, and I know they haven't won everything super convincingly, but they've won a lot of games convincingly. They did beat Indiana by double digits. They did beat Notre Dame by double digits. They did blow out UCF. The Tulane game was close for most of the game. That does give me concern, but they did end up pulling away in the game. And frankly, undefeated teams are rare enough. I feel like I got to put them high. I'll tell you one that's not on my list is Wake Forest, because they are not winning in dominant fashion. And frankly, Cincinnati's schedule is harder than Wake Forest's schedule, at least to this point. My number 5 is Oklahoma. Now, a lot of Oklahoma fans are going to be mad that I have Cincinnati ahead of them, but quite frankly, Oklahoma is climbing in my rankings. We've struggled to even put them in the top 10, but they're not there yet. I do think they've been a much better team since Caleb Williams took over. Rattler, I think he's a tremendously talented kid, but he clearly had the yips. He was holding them back. They're improving to what they need to be, and they're deserving of being in the top 5, in my opinion. Despite the fact that they struggled a lot earlier, they have started to produce well. This is where it starts to get hairy, right? Number 6 for me is Michigan State. I just don't have much reason to put anyone ahead of them. The Michigan win is a real win. I am not sold. I was the one that tweeted about this. I'll own it. Michigan and Michigan State were both undefeateds. The only Power 5 between them they had played with a winning record was Wisconsin. Everyone else, not even tied, they all had losing records. Every other P5 they played. So if you've got 2 P5s that are undefeated by default, necessarily one of them is going to win and be an undefeated P5. So Michigan State, to me, is still really sketchy. I didn't think their defense was impressive, especially pass defense. Personally, I think it's quite likely they're going to lose multiple games going forward. But the teams they may lose to, Ohio State's one, but I don't fault that at all. And maybe they lose to Penn State or somebody else, but given the what's out there, that's more than enough to be ranked number 6. Number 7 for me is Texas A&M. Same thing that you said, right? Mississippi State is turning out to be a hot or cold team, but a team that's good enough to beat people. The win against Alabama, in my mind, is the best win in college football. You could debate whether that's Oregon or theirs. They've looked pretty darn good the past few weeks. I think they're going to end up being a highly ranked team. I know they kind of played like crap early on. It's the inverse of Ole Miss, who started really strong and has now lost and have had to drop them out. I will tell you, drop them out completely after that loss. They're not going to finish the team they could have been. Oregon is my number 8. Again, people are going to mock 8, 9, 10. To your point, try and find someone that's definitively better. You run out of teams that people would justify as being a top 10 team in recent years. There's just not that many without blemishes. And Oregon has not looked great, but that Ohio State win is a real win, and everyone else has a blemish. My number 9 is Notre Dame. Same conversation you had. Notre Dame taking care of business for the most part. If you believe Cincinnati is a good team, and I do believe it, then you have to sort of excuse it. And they've done well against a schedule that, again, I don't think Wake Forest would have the same record Notre Dame has with that schedule. And then my 10th is Michigan, again, for the same reasons as you. That was a hard-fought game. I'm not going to punish them that much relative to Michigan State when I'm not even sure they lose in a rematch. And so I do think, if you notice, not a lot of SEC teams in my top 10. I mean, you've got Georgia, you've got Alabama, you got Texas A&M. A&M is going to be controversial. I think there's a lot of SEC teams in that 11 to 20 range. I kind of worry a little bit that we're punishing the SEC, as I said, for having so many in that range that beat each other up. But I guess 3 in the top 10 is still a lot.
But Josh, think about this: like Ole Miss, they're hurt right now. They don't belong in the top 10. I could see them getting a bowl matchup where they murder them because they might get healthy and really come to play. Auburn lost to Penn State and they got blown out by Georgia. They're not a top 10 team. And these are some of the more top SEC teams. Kentucky was in our top 10. They got murdered by Mississippi State today. Mississippi State's not a top 10 team. But Josh, I need to interrupt your broadcast to have you touch on something.
Okay.
And it happened while you were giving your top 10. Ohio State stormed the field.
Ohio State.
Stop.
I thought we'd been there before. I thought you'd won games before. You storm the field when you're excited to have upset someone, when it's a surprise, when you've proven yourself. You don't storm the field when you've beaten
a team that won't be ranked next week.
That won't be ranked next week. You just don't. So I know it was a close win over a ranked team, but no, you should be taking a breath and thanking that you escaped that one. You should be storming the field. That's crazy. I didn't even notice they did that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fun for the fans, the drunken fans that are there, that it's a late game and it's become more and more common. It used to be super rare. It's become more and more common. I'm not going to kill them too much, but yeah, I don't think they've ever stormed the field in Tuscaloosa. I don't know that they've ever stormed the field even at Georgia. I'm trying to think, I don't know that this is, like you said, there's two scenarios. One, you're Purdue beating Ohio State a few years ago. I think it's 2017. That's a storm the field moment, that whole thing. Or it's you were down by 25 points and you came back and won on a Hail Mary and you're just so excited in the moment that you just cannot control your emotions and you run out on the field. Or you won the national championship. Other than those three scenarios, don't storm the field. Don't storm the field against a team that won't be ranked next week.
Yeah, what was the point margin?
People are saying because it's a big rivalry game. No. First of all, it's a rivalry game, kind of, for Ohio State, but are you going to do this if you beat Michigan? I know that there's a joke there about how it's not a rivalry anymore, but just because it's a rivalry game, no. Alabama has beaten Auburn in Tuscaloosa however many times and hasn't stormed the field. Georgia has beaten Florida however many times in Jacksonville, hasn't stormed the field. You can't just say because it's a rivalry game that you're going to storm the field every time, because Penn State literally lost to Illinois last week.
Yeah, that was an 18.5 point spread, that game. You were a 3-touchdown favorite in that game.
So you didn't even cover and you stormed the field.
No. A&M storming the game because you beat number 1 Alabama field because you stormed out. Sure. Yeah, you beat number 1. Go ahead. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't even have words, man. I don't even have words.
We're getting killed kind of in the comments, but
all right. I feel like I feel like I've always seen this, right? People are really split on the storming the field thing. It's like, oh, let the kids have fun. Um, you don't police them. But I think I'd be curious where people like went like school or what they're fans of, because I think a lot of it swings on if you're someone that always feels like you got to root for the underdog and the underdog's always going to win and his verification. I think you're really very pro storming. We're like two cold hearted dudes, right? And we always end up picking.
We are
We pick the
curmudgeons.
we are kind of curmudgeons, and we pick the favorites to win a lot. And to me, like if you're a favorite and you win the game, but you win it close, you should walk away and be like, man, we got a lot of stuff to improve if you want to win a championship. Because our channel for whatever 5 years or however long we'll be doing this has sort of been focused on nitpicking people with an eye towards the playoff and the championship. But I think if you're just sort of excited to win a game, then you're typically a lot more likely to enjoy rushing the field, or at least that's the way I take it.
So I don't know what to take away from in general the SEC tonight, but I feel like some of the shine has been removed, given that Kentucky got murdered and Ole Miss lost. Like it's really down to, if we're going to talk about good teams, right? It's down to whether or not Auburn or A&M can win out, and then the assumed Alabama and Georgia. So, do you feel like this is a year where we can actually, the meme can be true? Because they always say it's like it's Alabama and everybody else, which is a very stupid thing to say. It's a casual, low football IQ fan thing to say. But is it this year maybe proven true that there's a couple of good teams in the SEC and everybody else kind of sucks?
Uh, I think we're devolving to that point that Alabama and Georgia are very high level teams and that everybody else is really mediocre. I do think again, we have A&M in the top 10 for a reason. A&M is actually turning into a legit team. We'll see if we're right about that when they play Auburn. But look, Ole Miss it's like, what are they down, like 3 offensive linemen, 3 or 4 receivers, and a tight end, isn't it? Isn't that where they're at this point? Like
Mm-hmm.
they're a shell, and if I've got that right, it's like 7 starters are out on offense. They're a shell of what they were, and I'll be curious to see it. But I think A&M ends up skull dragging them. Arkansas, Kentucky, I mean, due to injuries, motivation have really fallen off, and a lot of those teams. Arkansas every year. That's an interesting thing in recent years, right? They've started strong a couple times recently and then fallen off tremendously late. I don't know if it's depth. I think a lot of it is that we had a whole conversation about this, right? That their scheme, the sort of playback scheme that they have and the drop 8 stuff works when teams are sort of getting things together. But once teams are able to execute at a high level, it just falls apart and they get torched. It feel like at most of the SEC, the big thing to me is they've gotten worse. And this is where you got to be careful, like eye test versus quantitative, right? Because the teams are going to play each other and somebody's going to lose. But my eye test when I watch the SEC, I do feel like Auburn has gotten better. I feel like Florida is no better or worse than they are. They've been fluctuating. The defense has kind of improved a little bit. The offense looks on and off. But Kentucky has gotten decidedly worse. Ole Miss has gotten tremendously worse. I think Arkansas has gotten a
And
good
Ole
bit
Miss is the
worse.
only one of these that's going to get better, right? If they get healthy. Like the others are probably bad for the year.
Yeah, South Carolina wasn't ever. South
Never
Carolina was
good.
terrible to start with. Missouri is terrible to start with. Vanderbilt is terrible, like historically bad. Those 3 are almost all historically bad, dragging the rest of the conference down. And then you've got LSU, and I don't even know like if they're going to be able to field a team in a week. The offense is still solid. I think the defense is still pretty bad. So I do think there's a real argument that the SEC has 2 elite teams, maybe 2 pretty good teams, and a bunch of teams that do kind of stuck. So we've got a couple super chats are buried because we're doing our top 10. And I'm going to message them to Daniel so he can find them.
Somebody says we're being hard on Kentucky for losing to Miss State. They didn't just lose; they got beat down. Yeah, let's go back to some of these super chats, especially when the Braves are batting. So I'm a little distracted. Killtech9 says he's just here to say this. There's no reason to have Cincinnati in the top 5. They barely put up points against Tulane. They let Navy put up 50 or so. Georgia, Bama, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. I mean, okay, they barely put up points against Tulane. They beat them by a bigger spread than Oklahoma, and they beat them on the road. Oklahoma beat them by 5. The same Tulane team that lost 30-12 today to Cincinnati. Also, did you see the Kansas game last week? I love Killtack. Killtack comes every week. But I'm also not gonna because I love Killtack, I can keep it real. And I just did. Josh, you want to take the next one? Mike Farino said Ryan Day still only has one game in the I don't know what the
in the
rest of it
Big
was.
Ten where he didn't win by 2 scores. I mean, but that's been our thing, and I don't think he's disagreeing with us, right? That's been our thing with Ryan Day for a while, is that he consistently wins.
Mm-hmm.
And Urban Meyer was a fantastic recruiter, and he was an incredibly driven guy, but I truly believe Urban Meyer was so obsessed with winning and winning the next game that was in front of him that he really didn't know how to find balance and build a stable, sustainable program, if you want to put it that way. Like his teams would have major lapses every year. And I think people sort of took it for granted that was normal, but it's not normal. It wasn't an excusable thing. You shouldn't be doing that. And Ryan Day, we keep saying I still feel like amazingly Ryan Day is a very underrated coach.
Yep.
Like he's got his team like tops in the top level of the country now for years, and people still don't want to give him credit. He's done a phenomenal job. In the program, I know he inherited a good program from Meyer, but just the level of consistency they have, and I think just sort of institutional structure is tremendous. And I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for that.
So a lot of people came to Killtech's support in the comments. So I'm glad he got some support there since I didn't give him the love. Jermaine Jones, this is for the comments. The UGA defense does exist. Stop dismissing the plays just because y'all want to see big offense. And he said this a couple of times tonight. And we agree, Josh. Like the thing that happens, though, at least on our channel, is when you're talking about beating an Alabama and Ohio State back-to-back to win a national championship, you are going to get scrutinized at a different level. And to their credit, Georgia fans aren't as sensitive as what we've found Clemson fans to be. And this is a safe space. Clemson fans are off celebrating their big win over Florida State tonight. We couldn't say anything about Clemson. I remember specifically 2017, that game going in against Bama. We were like, y'all got some real concerns. And they were beside themselves, Josh, that we gave them any kind of criticism. Georgia fans have kind of been there, so they're used to it a little bit more. But you got to know, Josh, and maybe talk about this a little bit, like when you're up at the top, the flaws are what are going to maybe keep you from winning it all. And that's what we're going to talk about, because it's kind of boring to talk about how awesome your defense is. It's that good. That's why we're not talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's boring. It's probably not so boring for the fans, but I mean, do you want us to how do you want us to evaluate you? Do you want us to say, "Oh yeah, you're a great team. Don't worry, you're going to make the SEC championship"? Is that where you want us to have the conversation end? Because that's where it would end if we just talk about Georgia's defense. If you want to win the SEC championship, if you want to win a semifinal, if you want to win the national title, you're going to need more than just a defense, because you're going to play some teams that are going to put up some points at least. You're going to need some offensive consistency. And so part of the reason we critique it, or at least in my mind, the reason I critique it the way I do, is if you are in the playoff hunt and fans start talking about we're going to be like Cincinnati, that we're going to be a championship team. We haven't talked about them a ton because, frankly, there haven't been that many fans tuning in. Comparing Cincinnati to a playoff team, it doesn't even, as much as I'm ranking them high for their level of dominance, it doesn't even strike me that they'd be on an even field with Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and even be able to play in that game. I feel like they would be at a decided disadvantage for the entire game. But with Georgia and with Ohio State, and with Alabama, and you saw this today with Ohio State, Penn State, right? There's a lot of scaling that happens in football. And you can be, Ohio State was leading the country in scoring offense, and they play Penn State, and all of a sudden they look good, but they looked a little mortal, right? They're not scoring at will. And so if your goal is to win a playoff and to win a championship, then we're going to talk about the things you need to do to be able to do that. And you're not going to win a championship on one side of the ball. Again, Georgia's defense makes them number one in both our rankings because this year with the offenses that are out there, that's enough to win a championship, I think. But it just can't be examined in a vacuum.
Edward came back with a super chat. Stressful night. Ohio State still developing 6 freshmen starting bumpy. Yeah, I mean they are, but at this point, like they kind of are who they are, and I think that's again to Ryan Day's credit. And this is what I said last week about everybody's down on Bill O'Brien in Alabama for not having as good of an offense as Sark had. He's replaced a ton of people. Same thing with Ohio State. Like not only is Ryan Day replacing a lot of people, he's also replacing Justin Fields. That's a big deal. And yeah, it cost him the Oregon game, but they're still in a position to make the playoffs. All right, Josh, I got about 5 minutes left. I didn't get my afternoon coffee, so I'm a little tired. Let's tee up kind of what we want to discuss for the next 5 minutes. Like what everybody's saying that Penn State beat Auburn too, and they deserve credit. And so you're real big on making sure that those out-of-conference Power 5 wins are credited, which I would say like Arkansas over Texas still needs to mean something, and Penn State over Auburn, especially how Auburn's doing in the SEC, should mean something.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Look, this is something that's actually going to bother me, and I know people sometimes view us as like an SEC channel, but Penn State's probably going to fall out of the rankings this week, or at least be close to it. There's so many people dropping realize that it's not a sure thing they'll fall out. But Auburn is going to go up and Penn State's going to go down. And that does bother me because Penn State did beat Auburn and they're playing different competition. And you've got to give some credit to it. You can't just assume the SEC is better than the Big Ten. I mean, we've talked about the SEC a lot, but I think our curiosity is I really do feel like with the way the injury situation and the way certain teams are declining or down, this is the year. I don't think SEC is all that top to bottom, certainly. I don't think the depth is tremendous. And so you do have to start to question whether or not Penn State isn't a really good team in a very difficult conference. But, it is what it is. And it's just the constant fascination with win-loss records that Auburn's going to go up, Penn State loses, they're going to go down. And Penn State losses were to a top 10 Iowa, top 10 Ohio State, a bad loss to Illinois. And look, let me say one thing, though, right? If Penn State hadn't lost to Illinois, they would be ranked next week. Do we both agree on that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the one thing I'll add to that, though, is that if Auburn lost to Georgia State, they'd be ranked pretty low, too. Like Penn State lost their stupid game. They found a way to lose that, and that's just going to punish you, even though you beat Auburn. We always talk about the head-to-head stuff matters until you screw something else up. And the Illinois loss just straight up is a bad loss. It's a albatross. And that is what it is. But I do think, yeah, you're right. I mean, Penn State beating Auburn is becoming a really important data point. We talked about how that was going to be an important data point, and I don't think we expected Auburn to finish as high as they did. So it's ending up being in the Big Ten's favor for sure.
Somebody said, did Josh just say Penn State is a decent team? I don't know. Ask Ohio State. Like, yeah, they're a decent team. You can't, and people do this to pick on the SEC a lot. And they do. I've noticed they've been doing it to the Ohio State a lot too. Is they ignore all of your accomplishments and find your worst moment, your absolute worst moment, and try to make your entire team and your every accomplishment you've had all year be about your worst moment. They distill everything about you to that one thing, but they're not willing to do that for their team. Like their team is still good. Like, yeah, I mean, yeah, we lost to a G5, but we really put it together in the second half. Ohio State, man, they barely beat whoever. Like, come on. Like, if you're going to be critical and you're going to say, Penn State sucks because they lost to Illinois and erase all of the other things they've done this year, which they would have beaten Iowa if Clifford didn't get hurt. That's pretty clear. They did beat Auburn, and they just gave Ohio State all they wanted. So, look at what Wisconsin did today. Like, this is a team that just started out the season with a lot of good teams. Sometimes you're a good team, you're just not better than the great teams you're playing. So that's my piece. Josh, give us an outro, give us a minute or so, 60 seconds on what you saw today, and we'll close it out.
Yeah, and I'll add to the point you just made that I think Oregon is in the same boat, right? They beat Ohio State, and they had a couple weeks where they weren't playing good football. They had a bad loss, and that's all anybody wants to talk about. They don't want to accept the fact, they won their last game by a large margin,
Right.
and we're trying to give credit to that in our top 10. Look, what I saw this week was a lot of teams that were kind of on the bubble of being similarly ranked, right? Like Ole Miss and Auburn. That was going to be a game that sort of determined which one's going to end up in the upper half or lower half of the SEC West, and Auburn sort of clinched that now. Penn State and Ohio State was a real diverging point for where Penn State and Ohio State are going to finish respectively. I mean, that was a chance for Ohio State to have a second loss, and they just dodged it. But overall, I would say there wasn't a huge change to the status quo. The teams that were the teams on the rise or ascended or look like they're going to be a higher level teams at the end of the week generally won this week. And I mean, you could debate Michigan State, Michigan, but we never really were sold on which one it would be. So I do feel like we've sort of sorted out where the middle is a little bit. And the funny thing, certain people talk about a renaissance season. Won't say who that is, but might be a friend of ours. I do feel like that idea of topsy-turvy 2021, and it is somewhat topsy-turvy, is actually settling a little bit. The top teams are rising up more towards the top. Some teams that were like Penn State that have had struggles off and on are starting to look, Auburn and Penn State both are starting to look more like the teams certain people expected them to be. It'll be interesting to see if that continues, but it does feel like college football is getting a little bit more predictable again. And I got a pretty strong feeling that the usual suspects are going to end up winning out, and you're going to have a much more boring, predictable end of college football than people maybe want.
All right, y'all. Thanks so much for hanging out with us tonight. It's a lot of fun. Look for our previews coming up starting Monday. Y'all have a great week. God bless.